You're now live.
Thank you. I'm calling a Senate Finance meeting to order here on Thursday, January 13th. And we're going to listen to a rundown on the cannabis report presented to us by Bryn Hare from Legislative Council, who has worked on this and is ready to go. So without any further ado, Ms. Hare, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, committee. It's nice to be with you all. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Bryn Hare, Executive Director of the Cannabis Control Board. And I'm here today to talk about the Cannabis Control Board's fee report, which we filed with the legislature with the various standing committees back in October. My plan today was to walk through that fee report, which you should have on your website, but I'm glad to share my screen and go through that with you, since it sounds like that will be helpful to some of the committee members. So I think I just need to have access. Oh, I can do it. Thank you, Faith. Give me just one moment. Okay. Can you see, can everyone see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Well, not anymore.
Just
It
disconnected
disappeared.
herself.
This is a new way to really get your audience's attention. Like bring them to the cusp and then close your screen and come back a second time.
Does your screen still say that you're viewing Bryn Hare's screen?
No.
This happened to me yesterday. Even though she's gone, my computer still says that I'm viewing her screen.
You're on a sentimental machine. Whoever was there last, it keeps them.
So
Senator McDonald, it's worth noting in the break here that Bryn has moved to work for the Cannabis Control Board. They were smart to poach her.
She was snatched from a legislative council, and my introduction was a few months too late. So thank you for bringing me up to date.
Just to keep you up to date, she tried to sign in just now, but she got kicked out again. So I'm sure she'll be back.
Hi there. I don't know what's happening. I apologize.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm going to try again. Hopefully that won't happen again.
Well,
Okay.
So let me apologize for my my introduction, which was several months behind your career, which has moved to being the
I think I'm
current job.
Yeah, I sometimes don't know where I am actually. So you're forgiven. So anyway, I'm going to start over. I apologize for that little delay there. What I started introducing myself and talking, and then I realized I wasn't with you any longer. So I'm going to back up a little bit. So I was going to start out before I go through this presentation, which is a presentation about the board's fee recommendations, which was required by our enabling legislation. I was just going to give a little orientation to the committee about the board when they were seated and what we've been up to for the last several months, if that's okay. So the enabling legislation was Act 164. I'm sure this committee will remember it well. It passed in October of 2020, which was, I'm sure you'll all remember, kind of that marathon session. And so the bill went into effect in October, which was a little later than originally planned. The 3-member board was scheduled to be seated by January, according to that bill. That happened a little bit later than anticipated. So the board was seated in April of 2021. And during that time, the legislature was working on another piece of legislation dealing with cannabis, and that is Act 62. So since the board was seated, they have hired a couple of people. I was hired in July. And since July, the board has really been working kind of at a furious pace to meet the deadlines that were set out in statute. So what the board has undertaken in the last 5 months is that we've filled our 4 positions. So the board has an executive director, a director of operations, an administrative assistant, and a general counsel, which were the 4 staff that were allocated to the board in order to get the board's work underway and, you know, sort of lay the groundwork for opening up the adult use market. We've also had 33 full board meetings, over 75 meetings of our legislatively created advisory committee and its associated subcommittees. We have gotten our website developed and up and running, which has fielded over 200 public comments. We have submitted 3 and as of tomorrow, 4 legislative reports, including proposed fee structures, which is what we're going to talk about today. We've also initiated the procurement process with the Agency of Digital Services to start taking the steps required to develop our licensing portal and our seed to sale tracking software. And we've also drafted and pre-filed all 5 of our administrative rules that set up the regulatory framework for the adult use cannabis market. So we've had a really busy 5 months. And with that, I'm just going to jump into our report. I don't want to talk too much here, and there's quite a few slides, so I'm going to jump in. So overview of the presentation here is that we're going to, it starts out with just a background, some of the legislative language that required the report, what the board's process was in developing these recommendations. Then there's a segment of this report that talks about the market analysis that was done to understand the supply and demand for cannabis in Vermont. And then the next part of the report is our licensing structure recommendations, and then followed by the fee recommendations, and then a summary of our costs of the board and the associated fee revenue and tax revenue that's anticipated. And then we'll close with the local fee recommendations. So starting with the background requirements and process, the Cannabis Control Board, here they are, James Pepper, Kyle Harris, and Julie Hulberd. Here is the our advisory committee. And this committee probably remembers that this was a legislatively created committee that was established to sort of assist the board in its development of the regulatory framework and help it make its policy decisions. So that's a list of who was appointed to these positions and what their statutory positions were. Our advisory committee, in order to leverage it sort of appropriately based on the amount of time that we had to work with them, we decided to split them into subcommittees with and then we put people from the advisory committee onto these subcommittees based on their areas of expertise. So compliance and enforcement was the subcommittee that helped us develop really our regulatory structure of compliance and enforcement. Market structure, licensing, taxes, and fees subcommittee were largely working on this report with us. They helped us develop the fee recommendations. Medicinal cannabis was looking at the medicinal program. Public health, social equity, and sustainability were the other subcommittees. So those are our primary subcommittees that we used in developing our recommendations. The board did work with two consultants, the National Association of Cannabis Businesses and VS Strategies. And VS Strategies is a cannabis policy consulting firm. The director of economics and research helped us by developing the supply and demand model that we used in creating these recommendations. So the next slide here is the section of Act 62 that requires this report. And so this is the legislative language. I just wanted to point out, you'll see here that the board was charged with recommending fees that would be projected to be sufficient to fund its regulatory duties. And also whether that fee revenue that was going to be generated would be sufficient or whether the board would need to rely on some portion of the tax revenue to support its statutory duties. So we tried to do that in this report by giving you two different fee proposals. One that would potentially cover the board's costs, and another that would not quite cover the cost, but would foster a really diverse marketplace that would achieve the legislative objectives of our enabling legislation. Public comment. So I mentioned this a little bit at the outset. These numbers have all been updated. None of these numbers are accurate anymore since this was filed in October. We've actually had 34 full board meetings and 75 meetings of our advisory committee and associated subcommittees. And we've received over 200 substantive public comments through our web portal. So quite a bit of outreach has gone into the development of the proposals that you see. So the next part of the report is the market analysis. And I'll slide through so you can see the first page here is a screenshot of our supply and demand model. And so this is the model that our consultant developed via Strategies. The economists there developed this model. And it's a model that contains a very large number of different analyses and different models like within the model. It's an adjustable model, so you can plug in real-time data and see how it affects the outcomes. So for example, when we're licensing a certain number of cultivators, we can figure out the canopy size that we'll need to meet the demand based on the number of cultivators we're issuing licenses to, be they indoor or outdoor. And I will talk about that later. But really, this is to say this was a very complex model. It was like an Excel spreadsheet, the likes of which I've really never seen before. If the committee would like to have a deep dive into the model, our consultants would be glad to come and meet with you and do that. And it's also a little note just to say, I'm not an economist, and so I will do my best as I talk about the model. But essentially, it was created to help the board determine what the annual and seasonal demand is going to look like for cannabis, and also evaluate the total square footage of cultivation space that's going to be needed to meet the market demand, and also to project indoor and outdoor production timelines so we can better understand seasonal trends in the supply and demand.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a quick question while we go by that? Hi, Ms. Hare. I have a question about the word demand, market demand. So are you estimating in-state consumption, in-state and out-of-state consumption? I don't know what we're seeking, whose demand we're seeking to meet.
Yep, I'm going to talk about that. That's like the first few slides of this is what does demand mean? What kind of data are we looking at when we are answering the question of what the demand is going to look like? And I can say off the bat, it doesn't include some tourist data. It includes tourist data and some border state data as well. So it's primarily in-state, but also does include some out-of-state as well.
Thank you.
So the next slide talks about this is first and foremost, this is a screenshot of the index page of our supply and demand model. So assessing the market requires looking at the medical market. So the data about the medical market was sourced by our medical cannabis registry and some existing information from the medical operators. And then the second component is the adult use side. So Data analyzing the adult use side of the market came from Vermont consumers, 2 degrees of border consumers that are sort of right on the edge that would make sense that they would drive into Vermont to obtain their cannabis. And then some further away border consumers were also factored in. The drive may be a little bit longer, but they may be coming because they don't have an adult use program in their own state. And then finally, tourism data. So this slide shows a little bit more detail about the cannabis demand here. So as I mentioned, we've got resident medical patients. That's the light blue at the very bottom here. And then this big portion of the darker blue is the adult use consumers. And then this orange is border consumers 1, which, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of the border consumers that are right along the border that would have a relatively short drive to come in and obtain cannabis in Vermont. And then we have the second level of border consumers that may have a little bit further of a drive, that may have a motivation to come to Vermont. And then this yellow line here is the monthly tourist consumers. So this slide describes the process that was used and some of the data sources that were used. County and municipal level population projections were used to reach this projection of demand. Cannabis use frequency data, seasonal tourism data that came from the ACCD, seasonal demand trends compared from other states, national survey on drug use and health data, use on frequency and pricing, and then projected product category specific market share using existing data from medical sales in Vermont and also other regulated adult use markets in the Northeast. So now I'm going to move on to evaluating the cannabis supply. So the model uses 2 types of cultivation, and I'm going to talk about this throughout: the indoor and light supplemented greenhouse cultivation, which we really are just calling indoor cultivation, and then outdoor cultivation, which would also include basic hoop houses, greenhouses that don't use any light apart from light from the sun. And that outdoor cultivation type is really only capable of achieving about 1 harvest per year in Vermont, just because of the nature of our climate. And then a note that the board controls when applicants are going to receive licenses, but not when they complete their construction or they harvest their plants. And so the model does incorporate a degree of randomness into it to highlight the complexities of harvests that are coming onto the regulated market from cultivators at different times. So here is another screenshot of the model that shows cannabis cultivation. There's some more description on the next page, so I'm just going to slide through that. I know that slide is a little bit hard to read anyway. So essentially the supply is evaluated based on yield per square foot of flowering canopy. And it's then extracted either raw or to make high-end vaporizer cartridges, or it's dried and separated into flower and trim that could be used in other types of cannabis products, including topical products. And cannabis that's allocated for extraction to make those types of processed products is first turned into concentrate, and then it's divided among different types of manufactured products. So that is a little bit of explanation for this slide, which is the retail supply product production. So we've got, this kind of shows the different types of primary product categories that harvested cannabis can be turned into. And you can see the blue slide, the little blue line is cannabis flower, red is the pre-rolls, green represents the concentrates, yellow is the vaporizer pens, light blue is the edibles, and then purple is the topical products. So each one of these types of product will have quite a few different retail product varieties within these categories. So the supply and demand are evaluated on a product category basis within the model. So the supply is really going to vary in Vermont based on the total square footage of cultivation, what the yield is, how efficient our extractors are, and the allocation of oil to manufactured products. So this slide sets out what the total cultivation is, the total amount of projected canopy that will be needed to serve the demand that Vermont has for cannabis. So the explanation here is that we're going to assume that we are going to have a split of 20% outdoor cultivation and 80% indoor cultivation. And if that is the split, then we are going to need about 450 square feet of flowering canopy to meet the demand in Vermont. So something I just want to explain here is that you'll see the green at the bottom in this chart. This shows the green and then the red. And the red is showing when there will kind of be a spike in supply. And that's during the outdoor harvest months, so in the fall. So the note here is that while that outdoor supply is going to surpass demand in the fall, that inventory, as I mentioned in the earlier slides, can be processed in a way that the cannabis can be stored and those demands can be met in the winter and spring months.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Hardy has a question.
Thank you. Bryn, you might be getting to this, but I'm going to ask it before my brain forgets this question. In your supply and demand models, you talked about the demand from border states and tourists. What about the supply? Did you take into consideration supply that might be provided to, markets in other states?
So I think that what the model does is that it evaluates that that demand, incorporating the border states, only to the extent that those border visitors would travel into Vermont in order to purchase their cannabis. So our economists would be better suited to answer like how they achieved that, but they did make an estimation about which border, like how many border tourists and individuals would be willing to make that drive, either because they come from a state where adult use cannabis is not yet, there's not yet a market for it, regulated market for it, or for other reasons. Does that answer your question? No,
I understand that. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the law, which is entirely possible. But can a producer who produces cannabis in Vermont sell it in, I see Chris shaking his head no, so maybe that's the answer. Sell it in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or not New Hampshire, but another state where it's legal. Could they sell it?
No, I'm sorry. The answer is no. That
no,
it will have to be in state. Yep.
Okay.
Because of that may happen at the federal level if the feds decide to deschedule cannabis and legal it on a federal level.
Of course. All right. That makes sense. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll move on to the outdoor versus indoor cultivation slide. And this describes in some more detail the difference when we're evaluating how we need to meet the demand with our supply, why we need to create that split of 20% outdoor to 80% indoor. So outdoor cultivation produces less. As I mentioned earlier, it's because the nature of Vermont's climate, we really only have one natural harvest time, whereas indoor can achieve about 4. There are varying opinions about that, but about 4 harvests per year when you're growing inside. So that same 450,000 square feet of cultivation area would result in shortages during certain times of the year if that split were different. So for example, if 50% of the square feet of flowering canopy were allocated for outdoor cultivators, we would have a much more significant spike at certain times of the year and probably not enough not enough supply to meet the demand throughout the year. So these seasonal supply swings are described, I think, a little bit more on the following slide here. So this shows that with 20% of the cannabis grown outside, that's the sort of table on the left, and you'll see the gray area. This is indoor harvest, and then these green spikes are the outdoor harvest. So Oregon is a good state to look at when we're thinking about what the split should be between indoor and outdoor cultivation space. They're a good example of what can happen when the proportion of the indoor to outdoor is reversed from this 80-20. So Oregon had about an 80% outdoor cultivation area and about a 20% indoor. And the result of that was that there were really huge surges of supply, which resulted in kind of a glut of cannabis on the market during one particular part of the year. And that really caused prices to plummet. So you can see on the right here, if we had that 450,000 square feet with half of it grown outside, would result in these much larger spikes of product coming onto the market during the fall. So I'm gonna move on unless I see any questions. So this slide we can.
I do have just
Yeah.
a curiosity. How did Oregon manage to get so much of it grown outdoors? That's enviable in a way. Curious.
So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, they have a very different climate, and I think that the way that their illicit market works in Vermont, I imagine, is somewhat similar to California, where there's a really quite a number of people growing outdoors there in some larger canopy spaces than what might be predicted for Vermont. But that's a great question.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Hare, you were talking about prices plummeted when a glut hit the market. And so I'm just curious as to how the board sees its role in terms of price management. I'm sort of a little surprised to hear that it's a concern that there'll be price fluctuations depending on supply, but maybe you're aiming to help support a very stable industry, or I don't know, but can you say something about that?
I think that is the goal. I mean, I think it's the goal of the board to ensure that there's sort of a reliable and steady supply, and then there's not huge periods of oversupply to the market, because I just think that results in some instability, both for consumers, if they will have their demands met, and also just for the participants in the market, because I do think there are some price fluctuations when there's really large amounts of oversupply on the market. So one of the things that I think I mentioned earlier that our model can do is help us predict when we're getting to when we may have more outdoor cultivators on the market and less indoor cultivators. And we want to try and maintain that split of 80-20 so that we can ensure kind of a year-round steady supply to serve the market.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking a little bit of a very different thing, but so the state gets involved through the department and the PUC in regulating electricity prices. And one of the criteria for pricing is lowest possible price. There's two others, but so is there a thought on the part of the board that you all should design a system that meets the demands that you anticipate at quote unquote the lowest possible price? Or
well, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that this is because of the nature of this product as compared to like a public utility, for example. I'm not sure that is the goal of the board, to achieve like the lowest possible pricing for consumers.
Okay.
But that's an interesting question. I'm going to move on. I don't see any more questions on that. This is the total projected sales that are based on the model. So you can see, and obviously this will be dependent upon the board's ability to meet its timelines to issue the first licenses in 2022. So the top is the medical products. The second sort of set here are the adult use finished products. And then the bottom are the combined. And I know that JFO has some different projections for sales. So I'm not sure how much time you would like to spend here, but there it is. So the next part of the presentation goes into the board's recommendations for the licensing fee structure. So the type of licenses that are currently allowed for in the statute and what the proposed fees are. and some other relevant statutory requirements, and then some potential future licenses. So an overview here of the goals and objectives. Oh,
Mr. Chair.
Senator Hardy.
So actually, Bryn, if you could go back to the
Sure.
retail sales. That went by quickly before I could absorb it. So what are you assuming in here for pricing? If this is this gross sales?
yes. Yes, it is.
So this is pre-tax gross sales. So
I believe so, yes.
and then you said that JFO has different numbers. I'm assuming we're going to get those from Graham later today when we hear from him. But did you? I mean, I guess sort of along the lines of Senator Bray's question, like what are you assuming for our price? Not the lowest possible price, but does your model come up with a price point?
Yeah, so the data that was used to develop or to project the pricing, I believe, was from both the existing medical products that are sold in Vermont and also what the price of products are in our neighboring states that have it up and running adult use marketplaces. I think those were the two sets of data that were used to develop the projected prices.
Okay. I know, was there an assumption about inflation or deflation or?
That I will have to find out and get back to you about. I'm not sure. I presume so because the model is so complex. I imagine that they probably did predict that. And I know that they built in some reduction in prices as you move out in time with the assumption that New York will come online relatively soon and other states that have legalized will get up and running with their adult use market. So it does predict some decrease in prices in out years.
Okay. And I would assume depending on the type of product it is, there's a different price point. Some of it, they're
Exactly,
much, more desirable or more expensive to produce or whatever. So they're varying price points for the type of product.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
Depending on the extraction type and yes, depending on what the product is. I think it is very dependent on what the product is, what the pricing projection is for it.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I went by the slide so quickly. I can stay here.
So Bryn, don't be afraid to say if the question that is being asked is going to come up shortly in your presentation.
Okay.
I think we all realize that you're going to start out with your best estimates on pricing, and then in the first few months you'll make have planned to make some adjustments based on what turns out to be the case.
Yeah.
So feel free to continue.
Okay. Thank you.
Good.
So the next portion, we're going to move out of that portion and into the next portion, which is our licensing recommendations. So I'm going to just start with an overview of what the objectives of the legislature were in our enabling legislation. So the goal here is to foster a cannabis market that really reflects Vermont's culture and embraces its strengths. So we're trying to promote sustainability by encouraging outdoor cultivation wherever possible, and to include license types that are focused on providing access to small cultivators, individuals who are currently operating on the illicit or legacy market, and also people who are from communities that have been disproportionately harmed by cannabis prohibition. So the board does believe that these initial license type recommendations are going to start that process of creating an equitable market. And additional license types are going to be discussed a little bit later, and those could really further this goal. And I am going to mention now that I'm going to be referring to our January 15th report, which will be coming in tomorrow. It's not public yet, but that report also contains some recommendations of the board on additional license types that we think the legislature should think about. So more about that later. So an overview here about the license type and fee requirements. We were required to develop fee recommendations for these 6 license types: cultivators, product manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, testing labs, and integrated licenses. And we're required to tier out cultivators and retail license types. And we're required to recommend state fees to be charged, including an application fee, an initial license fee, and then any annual renewal fees for each type of license. And some other statutory requirements before I get into that proposed fee structure are that we needed to come up with a plan for reducing or eliminating license fees for people who are from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, or individuals who are directly or personally impacted by prohibition. The integrated licenses are defined and limited in statute to the existing medical businesses, and they also are facing a statutory $50,000 fee to the Cannabis Business Development Fund, which is that special fund that the legislature created to provide funding and support for social equity applicants or individuals who have been harmed by cannabis prohibition. The word small cultivator is defined in statute, and it is a tier for a cultivator with a plant canopy or space for cultivating plants for breeding stock of not more than 1,000 square feet. So when I refer to small cultivators, it means folks who are growing on 1,000 square feet or less. And plant canopy is also a term that's defined in statute, and it means square footage dedicated to live plant production. Doesn't include office areas, space used for storing fertilizer or other products. So the board developed 6 tiers of outdoor cultivation, 6 tiers of indoor cultivation. This says 1 mixed tier, but another thing that will be in our January 15th report is that we've now developed 3 tiers for mixed cultivation, which means it allows individuals space to cultivate inside and outside. And this committee will probably remember one of the unique facets of our enabling legislation was that you could individuals can only get 1 type of each license type. So for example, a cultivator couldn't get a license from the board, an indoor cultivation license and an outdoor cultivation license. So the board developed 3 tiers of mixed cultivation. 2 tiers for retail. Manufacturing now has 3 tiers, and then the other license types. So these are the cultivation license tiers. So for outdoor, again, we start at tier 1 at the small cultivator size of up to 1,000 square feet of total canopy, going all the way up to 37,500 square feet in our outdoor tier 6. And that's designed to fall within 1 acre, cultivation under 1 acre. And then indoor tiering, again, we start at up to 1,000 square feet of total canopy and going up to tier 6, which is 25,000 square feet, which is the highest level of indoor cultivation. And the board plans to only open up the lower tiers initially and not make the higher tiers available for licenses immediately.
If I may, when you use the term total canopy and square footage, so we're not talking about square footage of the growing space, we're talking about the square footage if you measure the plants at the canopy level. Is that the way it works?
That's correct. And that's why I talked about the definition of plant canopy, because that's a legislative term. And that's right, it's not just flowering canopy, it's the square footage that's dedicated to live plant production. So it's not just flowering canopy.
Thank you.
The next slide talks about these mixed tier licenses. And I mentioned a little earlier, we're trying to target small businesses and farmers and provide this mixed tier license that allows for some indoor and some outdoor cultivation. And this would give people the flexibility to grow both indoors and outdoors and perhaps achieve more than 1 harvest per year to have a more sustainable business model. So the retail license tiers, there are two of them. Tier 1 is the storefront tier, and that would be sort of a traditional brick and mortar retail location that would sell cannabis and cannabis products to consumers. They could also sell the products that the lower retail tier could sell, which is the nursery tier. And that is more of a limited retail. It would only enable the licensee to sell seeds and clones to other licensees or to home cultivators. And that type of license could be a standalone business, or it could be held by an existing business, as long as they're meeting the regulatory requirements.
Bryn, so an individual can only have one kind of license, right? So what if they are growing and they have a canopy? I'm going to sound stupid asking this question, but I'm going to just ask. They have a flowering canopy of a certain number of feet, and then they also are trying to grow. Can they also grow clones and like mother plants and things like that? Or is it just they can do one or the other?
No, they can do that. And let me clarify something, because a licensee can get different types of licenses. They just can't obtain more than one of each type of license. So there's no opportunity for like franchising, for example, because a business could only have one retail license, for example, but nothing would prohibit a cultivator from also obtaining a retail license.
Okay, so they could have a license to cultivate, and then they could have a license for
Yes.
nursery, like a retail nursery kind of
Yes.
thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the manufacturing license tiers. And because this was submitted in October, the board has added one additional manufacturing tier here. So manufacturing tier 1, this would enable the licensee to process and manufacture using any type of allowable method of extraction, which would include a solvent-based extraction. And they can sell their products to retailers and other licensees, but not directly to consumers. And then the second tier of manufacturing would enable the licensee to do the same type of thing, but they couldn't use any of the more dangerous solvents in their extraction. So no solvent-based extraction. This one aims to be a lower cost license for businesses that want to make infused or processed products. And then the third type of manufacturing tier, which is not included on the slide, but the board has recently decided on, is an even smaller manufacturing tier, which would allow the same methods of extraction as tier 2, but it would only allow the business, it's only for businesses that would be making up to $10,000 worth of cannabis products on an annual basis. So it's a little bit lower fee. I'm going to move on to the other license types, which are the integrated. And we talked about that earlier. Those are defined in statute. The wholesale license allows the licensee to purchase cannabis from a licensee to sell to other licensees, but these wholesalers cannot sell directly to consumers. And then the testing labs are licensees that can test cannabis from other licensees or from any home cultivators in the state.
Can I ask a question about how these things might work together? So if I had built a perfect space for growing, and it's 10,000 square feet, and I only have a license for 1,000, can I, for instance, rent out some of my unused space to someone else who is a legitimate individual who goes out and gets their own license? In other words, can I basically have the space, but I'm not growing anything? It's just that I said, well, I'm going to make better use of my space, have a second revenue stream, because I'm actually a landlord to someone else who's growing on at the same site, but they are their own business.
So the board has come up with some regulations about what is required of a business in its space, and also some regulations around co-location. So I don't think anything in the statute would expressly prohibit that, but there are going to be regulations about surrounding that kind of operation.
Okay, thank you.
So the next slide is about potential future license types. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be submitting our third legislative report this Friday, which summarizes additional license types that the board is recommending that the legislature authorize. So since there's more up-to-date information about this coming tomorrow, I'm going to skip over these 2 slides, but I did just want to mention that the board is proposing that the legislature authorize some additional license types. And I will talk about those a little bit later in this report. So skipping over that, these are our October ideas for additional potential future license types. More information to come. So the next portion of the report are the fee recommendations. So we're going to start by talking about the format of the recommendations, because we are coming in with 2 separate recommendations, and then we'll go through them, starting with application fees and then license fees. And then we'll talk about our recommendations about the reduction of fees for social equity applicants. And then finally, our recommendation on which fee the legislature should adopt. So again, just a reminder, we went through that statutory language in the beginning of the report that noted that the board was required to propose fees that would cover our operating expenses, as well as repay any appropriations that we've received. And so even with the budget that we are anticipating, due to Vermont's small size and the small potential market, covering all of our costs through these fees is going to result in fees that are much higher than they are in neighboring states and comparable states. They would really be outlier fees when compared with other adult use markets around the country. So while we still structure these fees in our proposal to prioritize small businesses, small cultivators, prioritize access to the market, we really do have concerns that the high fees that are proposed in Proposal A would prevent people from entering the market and really prevent us from having a diverse and robust market. So as that is the rationale for submitting 2 different fee proposals, Proposal A and Proposal B. So you'll see throughout, there will be 2 columns of the proposed fees. One will be higher, that's Proposal A. That's the one that covers our costs. And then Proposal B, which was designed to make us more competitive with neighboring states, and to really foster the goals of the legislation to provide low-cost entry for many different license types, really prioritize the small businesses, and keep fees competitive with our neighbors. And Proposal B, I will note here that would require that the CCB not be entirely fee supported. We would be requesting a portion of the excise taxes in order to cover our costs if the legislature adopted Proposal B. So with that, I'll jump into the actual fee recommendations. So the first slide here is our intent to apply fee and application fee. So the board is really picturing that this will be a 2-part process where applicants can file an intent to apply application to sort of, so the board can do kind of a limited check on them and allow that applicant to have some security that they can go out and start finalizing their business plans. So if an applicant does file an intent to apply fee, their application fee, when they do submit the full application, will be reduced by the fee for the intent to apply application. So there's a lot of benefits to using this process, including that the board will have information at the outset to get a sense of what the entrepreneurial demand will look like, how many people are interested in participating in the market. And also it allows applicants to have some initial approval for them to sort of be secure with before they go out and get investors and save money and procure real estate and all the steps that need to be taken to start a business.
So can I just ask?
Senator Pearson.
Thank you. So really, well, under either construct, so it'd be, if you took the 2-step approach, it'd be 500 at each step, or is it a total of 1,500?
Nope, it would be it's going to be a total application fee of $1,000 either way.
Okay, thank you.
So jumping into the license fee recommendations, we start with our outdoor cultivation proposals here. And you can see that they start relatively low with tier 1 and they progressively get higher. And as I noted earlier, the board has now proposed 3 mixed tiers. So the mixed tier level 1 would be up to 1,000 square foot of indoor cultivation space plus 50 plants. And the recommendation there for proposal A is 4,500, 1,750 for proposal B. And the other 2 would be, so tier 2 of mixed tier would be up to 1,000 square feet of indoor cultivation space plus 125 plants outdoors. Our proposal for that fee would be 2,250. And then mixed tier 3 would be up to 2,500 square feet of indoor cultivation space and up to 200 outdoor plants. And the fee proposal for that would be 5,000.
Could you just remind us what the current medical fees are? Because I remember they seemed really high, but I think they're kind of in this range.
Yes, and you're gonna have to forgive me because I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but I will find out and get back to you before the end of the meeting. Sorry.
And are these
Get it right.
annual fees that correspond to the calendar year? Or
Yes.
are they, yeah, thank you.
Yep, annual fees that I should have indicated that up front. These are annual fees. So you would pay this fee at the outset to obtain your license, and then you would pay it on an annual basis moving forward. And apologies for not knowing the answer to your question, Senator Pearson, but it's $25,000 annually for the current medical fees. Okay, so in other words, Senator Bray, these are annual fees. So there's not a different fee for an initial application and a different fee for a renewal. It's all the same. So it's a relatively simple, straightforward fee structure.
If it turns out that the number of licensees is oversubscribed, does getting a license once then assure you of renewal? Other than if you don't pay on time or there's some other thing where you break the rules. But
no, I mean, I don't think that it would ensure that you could renew. I imagine that the board would want to create some assurance that a business that has invested in standing itself up would not just have its license not renewed for no reason. But as I mentioned at the outset, having access to that model will help the board to prepare for what the supply will look like. And since we have this demand that we understand, we can kind of tailor what licenses we issue based on how the market looks at the time.
okay, so is it just that it's undecided at this point what the renewal rate will be? Because the demand won't be known till it's really up and running. I mean, I'm just thinking how difficult it might be to start a business if you didn't feel confident that when the next January rolled around, you'd simply pay your fee and continue operation.
So I think that would be the goal. I don't, our regulations provide what circumstances your license would be revoked. I think that a business could rest assured that by paying their renewal fee, they could keep operating as long as they were not in violation of any of the regulatory framework. And that's why I said, I think that the goal of the board would really be to make sure to front end those decisions about who gets an application based on what the existing market looks like, rather than revoking a license of a business that's complying with its regulations later on.
Thank you.
Are you saying that the answer to that question isn't quite nailed down yet and will be sometime in the near future?
Well, I think the answer to the question is that the board does not plan on revoking licenses based on some inequity in the market. I think that the board will front end those decisions about who gets a license based on what the market looks like at the time, as opposed to dealing with it later on. So I think I can answer that question now.
Fine.
Well, I think it did
To be
yeah.
not
to-
quite nailed down at this time, but the board is considering it and we will learn later. Thank you. Continue.
Okay. Okay, so these are the indoor cultivation license fees. So you can see the outdoor cultivation fees are about a quarter of what the indoors are, to account for the fact that indoor growers are going to be able to achieve about 4 harvests a year. And as I mentioned earlier, these largest indoor tiers will not immediately be accessible. Here are the retail license fees. So proposal A is $10,000 for a storefront, proposal B is $5,000, and then $4,000 for the seeds and clones retail, limited retail, and $1,000 for proposal B for the limited retail. Manufacturing licenses, 15 for proposal A is 15,000 for a tier 1, 7,500 for proposal B for tier 1, and then 5,000 for tier 2, 1,500 for proposal B. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that tier 3 manufacturing, the proposal would be $750 for that license fee. So here are the other types of fees. So the integrated license, the proposal in proposal A is $125,000, proposal B is $50,000. So if they, that would ultimately be an initial $100,000 fee for them, since they are kicking in that $50,000 to the business development fund. And you can see the rest of those fees there. We did put in, suggest a local processing fee of $100, maximum of $100, or a recommendation that municipalities follow the uniform fee schedule, which is set out in statute, which is the fee schedule that is followed for like public records requests. And, you know, this situation is a little tricky because it really is a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. We're not sure what the costs are going to be associated with hosting a cannabis establishment. We're not sure what the cost of the municipality will be. Everything that the board heard in its work, hearing public comment and its work with its advisory committee, were really just hypothetical costs. Actions that maybe could lead to an increase in enforcement activity, but it might not happen at all. And so we really look to other jurisdictions to see what's happening there with respect to local costs. And what we heard back from other states with a legal adult use market is that those local costs are really limited to how much time it took for the select board, for example, to review an application. So that's why we recommended the $100 fee, because we anticipated that that would cover the cost of the reviewing of the application.
Britt, can you, I'm sorry, can you just make that a finer point? The municipalities you heard back from basically were not reporting big costs as an impact of the presence of a retail store. Is that another way of saying what you just said?
Yes, it is that we did not have, we were not given any information, solid information about what those local costs would be. The municipalities were present at all of the meetings of the market structure subcommittee in which we talked about local fees. And the only information that we got was that there could be potentially some hypothetical costs associated, but there was nothing, no firm information was given to us about those costs.
But did I understand that you were checking with municipalities in, say, Massachusetts? Yes. Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thanks. That is important because we've heard, this has been a topic over the last couple of years. So thank you.
Yep. And one of our consultants is a former commissioner on the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, who worked really extensively with municipalities in Massachusetts in setting up a cannabis market there. And she was helpful to us in engaging with Massachusetts to find out what the local costs were. So I'm going to keep moving to our social equity provision here.
Is there a question?
I do have a question.
Okay, I can't see you, so go ahead.
Okay. So Bryn,
Senator
I'm a little
Strzok.
confused. Picking up on Senator Pearson's question, seemed to have been a lot of controversy in the last couple of years as to how much revenue the municipalities would get. Last I remember, we landed on they would get revenue to cover their cost. Am I mixing apples and oranges here? Because I thought that was a share of the excise tax that was going to go to municipalities, and this is licensing fees.
Right. So the municipalities with a local option tax will see some revenue if they're hosting a retail establishment. But what the legislature asked the board to do was to recommend fees that would cover the costs of the municipalities that are hosting any cannabis establishment. And as I mentioned, as I just discussed, because the board didn't hear any concrete numbers of what those costs would be for municipalities, our proposal would be to have a local fee that would cover the cost of those local select board members, for example, reviewing a local application for a cannabis license.
So a city like Burlington didn't come in and make the claim that they may have more law enforcement costs at all?
So what we heard from VLCT in our hearings and our advisory committee member who was representing the municipalities was that there could be potentially some additional enforcement costs that would be shouldered by the municipality, but there was no proposal for what those costs would be or what the fee should be to cover those costs. And as I mentioned earlier, they were really hypothetical situations. It was not there was not any way to predict what those local costs could be. It could be one issue, it could be multiple, or it could be none. So because they were so hypothetical in nature, this is the recommendation that the board went with.
Another question on not related, but so are these fees all designed in proposal A essentially to cover the budget of the board?
Yes,
And what is that budget? What's the number you're looking for?
it's approximately $3 million a year, and that those slides are coming where we talk about what the costs are that we're trying to cover.
Okay, so you start with the costs and then you back into the fees. to
Correct.
cover those costs.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So the next slide talks about our social equity applicant fee reduction recommendations. Since we're talking about the fee structure here, here is the slide that describes who a social equity applicant will be and what their fee reductions will look like. So the board, this again has been slightly modified. There will be a slightly different version of this in our report that we're filing tomorrow. It updates these criteria for social equity applicants by narrowing them just slightly. So if you meet one of these two criteria, you would be considered a social equity applicant and be eligible for the fee reduction. If you're a person of color, or if you're a person that can demonstrate you're from a community that's been historically disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. Or if you're a person that, and this is where these criteria have been refined slightly, if you're a person that's personally been incarcerated for a cannabis related offense, or if you have a family member that's been incarcerated for a cannabis-related offense. So we've taken out these words and just narrowed it to if you've been incarcerated. And the board has provided that you don't need to have a previous Vermont residency to be eligible for a social equity application, as long as you live in Vermont currently. And the proposal is that those application fees, the $500 intent to apply fee and the $1,000 application fee, should be waived for social equity applicants. And then the license fees should be waived in the first year and then reduced progressively in the following 3 years. So reduced by 25% or reduced by 75% in year 2, 50% in year 3, and then 25% in year 4.
I have, Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Bryn, was number 2, I can see some controversy around this one. Was that in the law?
So what was in the law was that the board was required to identify social equity applicants or people that would be eligible for funding from the Cannabis Business Development Fund and any other sort of technical assistance or benefits that the board could provide if they were from a disproportionately impacted community or if they were personally disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. So this was the board's recommendation to satisfy that second criteria, a personal impact by cannabis prohibition.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Pierce.
Bryn, how do you, I think this is interesting and I appreciate that a lot of thought's gone into this. Call me cynical, but I worry that we won't be looking at a company started by somebody that's been incarcerated that comes forward and applies, but rather a company might get everything together, find somebody that's been incarcerated and put them at the front. And I maybe this is impossible to worry about, but I'm just curious, since so much thought's gone into this, you know, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that is what we need to do, but I'm just curious if there's been thinking about how do we sort of protect against a bit of a fictional front coming at us to take advantage of this policy.
Yep, that's a great question, because I think Massachusetts really wrestled with that when they unveiled their social equity program. So a part of what is included in our administrative rules are kind of guidelines about or parameters on the social equity program. And they include that a social equity applicant, in order to be eligible for any of these benefits, that applicant would have to be at least a 51% owner of the business and be involved in the day-to-day operations of the business and be authorized to make decisions about the business. So the board in its regulatory framework has attempted to kind of prohibit those circumstances where a big business would kind of poach a social equity applicant and receive the benefit as a result.
Thank you.
Okay. So Vice Chair, I have a question.
Yes. Welcome back.
Thank you. And I'm going to let you finish this one out. Bryn, this is Ann Cummings, because I can't see anybody. This is social equity, and I'm putting on my devil's advocate hat. But we have a large, we are told, underbelly of Vermonters who are struggling to make ends meet. We found as we went through this process, there was a significant grow your own market out there that was perhaps offsetting those, low income, selling some things other than maple syrup and firewood. If we go by the letter of the law, a new American who happens to be a person of color could get, this advantage. But a poor Vermonter who's been here, got the requisite 5 generations in the ground wouldn't. And if we got any, is this, everybody's going to have to come up with the same capital investment? I mean, was there any thought about that in this kind of politically tense time?
Yes. So what you are referencing is kind of directly questioning something that we have in our January 15th report,
Okay.
which is some additional benefits that would apply to other types of candidates who may not meet these criteria for social equity, but would and should be eligible for some economic empowerment opportunities.
Okay.
So though that isn't included here in this report, it will be in a follow-up report.
Okay.
So we tried to really ascribe to the task we were given, which was to provide benefits to those individuals and communities that have been, there's evidence to demonstrate that they have been disproportionately harmed. But the board has put a lot of thought into how to provide opportunities for other folks too.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so moving on to the next slide here. This is our fee proposal recommendation officially that we are recommending the legislature adopt proposal B, which features the lower fee schedule. As I noted at the outset, we were tasked with proposing fees that would cover our operating costs, but also to identify whether this wouldn't be possible and that we would need to be partially funded from a portion of the tax revenue. It's a recommendation of the board that the legislature adopt the lower fee structure in order to achieve the objectives of our enabling legislation. And that includes like ensuring that we have a diverse marketplace that prioritizes small cultivators. And really hand in hand with that goal would be ensuring that we bring the illicit market into a regulated space. One of the directives to the board that we're responding to in our January 15th report is to recommend additional license types. And in consultation with our advisory committee, the board has been developing recommendations for the legislature to establish additional license types. And those include a delivery license, an on-site consumption license, and a special event license type. So adding these, if the legislature were to add these licenses to our existing framework, we would further capture the illicit market by offering these services within a regulated services that exist on the regulated in the illicit market, offering them in the regulated market. And also offering these additional types of licenses would further close the revenue gap between these proposed fees and the board's regulatory costs. So that's just a preview of what will be included in our January 15th report, is that the board will be recommending that the legislature adopt some additional license types that could generate significant additional fee revenue for the board. And here, Senator Cummings, a note at the bottom here, the board has been considering all along methods for low-income applicants to make sure that there's opportunities for all Vermonters to benefit from participating in the market. So
Senator
more
Pearson.
information on that to come.
So, Bryn, did I hear you say that if we were to consider the additional license types that we're going to see maybe in the next few days, then tier 2 proposal B plus those ends up covering costs, or are we still needing extra revenue?
So I can't say that yet. We don't have associated fee proposals for those additional license types because we're really just responding to the legislature. The request of us was to identify additional license types that the board recommends. So we haven't gotten that far down the road yet.
Okay.
So I can't
Well, and
answer that.
Thank you. If we adopt proposal B, how much general fund revenue does the board need for operations?
Approximately 20%, and that's coming a little bit later on. 15 to 20%, I believe.
Sorry. Okay. Thanks.
That's okay.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Swack,
So, Brent, can you help me understand how heavy these fees are for these various operations? I mean, sometimes fees are minuscule, and sometimes fees are, whether it's a fee or an insurance payment, like medical malpractice insurance premiums are a big deal for doctors in terms of their cost. But I don't have a sense of any of these fees, whether they're going to be barriers to people entering the marketplace, and whether pricing could take care of this. I guess it's, in some ways, it's hard to make one of the decisions it sounds like you're asking us to make is whether we go through proposal A or proposal B. I sort of need to learn a little bit more about how heavy these proposed fees are on these business operations.
Sure. So there's several slides that are coming up that I think are going to help answer that question. We've got some comparison charts that show what those proposal A fees look like in comparison to fees in other states, to show sort of how out of line they are with the existing fee types in other adult use marketplaces. But also just to help frame your thinking about this, Vermont really is a relatively small market compared to other places. And several aspects of the enabling legislation make it so that it might not be a very appealing place for a big multi-state operator, for example. There's unlimited, there's not a limit on the number of licenses that the board can issue. So there's not kind of like a false monopoly situation that could be established for a big player. Also, the regulatory burden is, I think, maybe even a bigger hurdle for a lot of market participants than the fees. It's the fees themselves. If you take a look at our proposed rules, they establish the regulatory framework in conjunction with what the legislature asked us, how the legislature asked us to regulate. And they really impose quite significant costs on anybody who would want to join the market. So those are just some other considerations. I know it's not directly answering your question, but I do think that some future slides will help.
That is helpful. I'm sorry to turn back the clock here. So what is subject to regulation and what is subject to statute? So I assume these fees are actually going to come before us, the amounts?
Yes.
Not go through rules?
Right. The fees we don't have the authority to set these fees, only the legislature does. So that is kind of a prerequisite to us opening up the market.
But there's a lot of regulations that are in the process of LCAR now, or you're waiting on
Yes.
those?
Yes, correct. All 5 of our administrative rules have been pre-filed. So I'm happy to share. They're all up on the board's website if anyone's interested in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
so Brenda, are you done or are you going to keep
No, I'm
moving
going to
here?
keep going. I thought I saw another question. I'm sorry. I'll keep going.
No,
Okay.
get back on your horse.
Okay. Okay, here I go. So the next part of the presentation is talking about our costs. So you guys are ahead of me. So we're going to go through our budget projections. And then this is a really important part of this report actually is scenarios for the number of applications, which obviously will, our revenue projections are going to be dependent on how many people are going to join the market. So, and then we have some justifications for the 2 different fee proposals And then I get to the slides that compares the proposals to the different jurisdictions. And then lastly will be the tax projections. So here is the information about our budget. Our projected budget in October was about 2.7 million. It's a little bit higher than that now because we have some additional information about how much our licensing portal is going to cost. But we believe that if we can bring in annual fee revenue of approximately 3 million by FY25, we'd be on track to repay our deficit within 10 years, which is required by the statute. This budget that I just described includes 11 positions that we don't currently have. As I mentioned when I opened up, right now we have 4 staff members. We submitted a request to the House Appropriations Committee last week for an additional 11 positions in order to achieve the objectives of the legislature to regulate this market. And those include 3 licensing staff, 6 compliance and enforcement staff, a financial manager, and a data and information manager. And this is really a very basic level of staffing that we need in order to carry out the regulatory function that we've been assigned. So just a quick update to this slide, the House Appropriations Committee did approve 3 licensing staff in budget adjustment. The cost of those 3 staff just for the remainder of this fiscal year will be just under $61,000 if we're able to onboard them on May 1st. So our full proposal was 11 positions. Appropriations decided to give us 3 in budget adjustment and more thoroughly vet the rest of our proposal later on. So unless I see questions, I'm going to keep moving here. So the next few slides describe the scenarios for the number of license applications that the board will get. And as noted early on, there's quite a bit of uncertainty in predicting the number of people that will want to participate in the market, since it depends on a number of factors,
Bryn,
including, yes.
Or Mr. Chair, whomever I'm supposed to ask. I'm sorry to go back to your
Senator
budget.
Hardy, go ahead.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. The budget question, I we're not the Appropriations Committee, but I just have to ask, how does this compare to like the Liquor Control Board or another similar board in terms of staffing?
Sure. So I submitted to the committee the memo that I wrote for the House Appropriations Committee that actually does provide a comparison table with staffing ratios that we're asking for and staffing ratios that exist in other states with an adult use market. And so you can really compare it based on the number of full-time employees as compared to the number of licensees that the regulatory agency is regulating. So I'm glad to talk about that now. If you'd like to transition to that, I can show you, or we can wait and do that later. But I did provide a comparison so you can see that what we are requesting is very much in line. It's actually even a little bit less than the average numbers of full-time staff in other regulatory bodies that regulate cannabis in other states.
Okay, I can take a look at
Bryn,
that.
why don't you move ahead and all members of this committee will expect this committee to make and ask for such comparisons when the actual numbers come in. So
Okay.
From your final report. Thank you.
Okay. Just so you know, it is on your website if you'd like to take a look at it.
Yep.
Okay. So I was just about to get into the different scenarios for the number of applications. And I think I was saying that the demand is a little bit easier to predict than the supply. So the way that our consultants helped us with this was to pull statistics from similar states and provide us with 3 different scenarios to help us kind of frame what the market could look like. So there's a dynamic 1, a dynamic 2, and a dynamic 3, which you will see coming up. So this is just another slide that describes how it's tricky to predict entrepreneurial interests. The fee, what the fees are is one predictor. If fees are very high, it's possible that those high fees are going to discourage participation in the market and therefore lower our projected total fee revenue. So I will show you these slides to kind of give you a sense of what the different scenarios would look like. So this shows the projections for the number of cultivation licenses under these three different scenarios. So you can look at dynamic one as kind of being a best case scenario where there's really robust entrepreneurial participation in the market. And there's a whole bunch of people who are participating. Dynamic two is sort of an in-between scenario, and dynamic three is a little bit of a worst case scenarios situation where we don't have very robust participation and perhaps the illicit market continues to thrive. And I'll go to the next slide. This is our other types of licenses, retail, manufacturing, and the other license types, again, under those three separate dynamics. And all of our, and by the way, my recommendation or our proposal on staffing was directly related to these projections for the number of licenses that we'll be regulating. So I'll move on to the fee projections based on those three dynamics. So as you can see under dynamic one, if we had, if the legislature adopted proposal A and there was really very robust market participation, we'd be in great shape. But it's our estimation, it's the board's estimation, and the thought of our consultants that if the legislature were to adopt proposal A, we would be much more likely to move to a dynamic three situation with much less market participation and therefore less fee revenue. And then you can see proposal B, if we're around a dynamic two, which is where we predict we will be, if the legislature adopts proposal B, we would be generating about 1.3 million in fee revenue.
Senator Pierce.
Thank you, Bryn. I'm just curious, dynamic two isn't, but it is between dynamic one and three, but it's not anything like, it's quite a drop from dynamic one. And that's, I wonder if you could help me. Oh, okay. No, here it's more symmetrical in the first slide. It's not a neat. So I guess
Right.
that explains the difference. Okay.
Yeah, it's about a third of the cultivation participation and about half of the other entrepreneurial participation.
And so that's where you envision the illicit market remaining. I see. Okay. I've answered my own question. Thank you.
Right. Okay. I think this is where it was. Oh. So the next slide is the fee justification requirements. This is just statutory language that our fee proposal should be accompanied by a justification, which is included on the following slides. So the justification that the board is providing for proposal A are that these fees this is the fee schedule that would cover the operating costs associated with the Cannabis Control Board. So we estimated the revenue that we would need to support ourselves, and we estimated the number of licenses across those three dynamics and developed a fee schedule based on what was needed to cover our costs. So again, proposal A, fees are significantly higher for many licenses than in other markets. And I promise it's coming, those comparison slides that show you exactly how much higher. Justification for proposal B, as I've mentioned, I feel like I'm harping on this point, doesn't cover our operating costs, but it does generate significant annual revenue. It proposes fees that are comparable to the fees for adult use cannabis in other similar jurisdictions, and those slides are coming right. It's much more likely than proposal A to foster a diverse marketplace and an equitable market with plenty of supply to meet Vermont's consumers' demand. And again, as mentioned in those dynamic slides, The high fees of proposal A are much more likely to create a risk that the full market doesn't develop and that sales remain on the illicit market. So because we need approximately 3 million to cover our operating costs and repay our deficit, we would need approximately 15 to 20%, I think it's closer to 20% of the excise tax revenue or general fund revenue to meet our operating budget. But again, as I've mentioned before, all participants in this regulated market are going to benefit from having access to safe and tested cannabis products. So it's the board's position that it's really reasonable for consumers to share in the cost of managing the market by assigning a portion of that tax revenue to cover the board's regulatory function. And one other thing I wanted to mention here on this slide is that almost no other adult use, like jurisdiction where adult use cannabis is regulated, is entirely fee supported. Washington, Maine, New York, New Mexico, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Washington, DC, New Jersey, all either receive a portion of general fund revenue or a portion of the excise tax revenue to support their regulatory function. So it's not unheard of by any means. I'm going to move on now to the fee comparison with comparable jurisdictions. So this sets out the Vermont proposal A and B here at the bottom, and it shows you how that compares with Alaska, Maine, and Massachusetts. And I know there's like a lot of text on this page, so it might be hard to know where to look, but I'd like to draw your attention specifically to the Massachusetts indoor fees and the associated square footage. So under proposal A, we would be charging $100,000 for our largest tier of indoor cultivation, which would be 25,000 square feet. So that would be double the fee for a quarter of the square footage. Sorry, there's people on my roof and I can't tell if you guys can hear how loud it is, but it's very loud to me. Let's see. So about a quarter of the cultivation space and double the fee amount. And the other thing to think about is just the demand that exists. So like Vermont is about, I think the demand is about 1/10 of what it is in Massachusetts. So these are all considerations that a business would look at in deciding whether to seek a license in Vermont. And it just helps to show how out of step that proposal A fee structure would be in comparison to other states. So not only is Vermont's sort of market smaller, but we're also offering much smaller spaces for cultivation as compared to other states. So that's another reason why those fees are quite out of step with other states. And then here are the manufacturing license, testing license, and you can see here proposal A really quite a bit higher than the other states. So I'm going to move on now unless I see questions to the tax projections. So tax projections are, and I do think you'll be hearing from Graham later on, who may have some different projections. But ours are that by 2025, we'll reach kind of the peak, which is 45.8 million. There's a note here on the bottom of the slide that reminds you about where that tax revenue is going. So by statute, 30% of the excise tax revenue, which is the bigger portion here, the red, is to be used for substance misuse prevention programming, not to exceed $10 million per fiscal year. And then the sales and use tax revenue is to be used to fund a grant program or to start or expand after school and summer learning programs. And you can see here by 2026, the fee revenue projections are dropping a little bit. And again, that's in line with the projections that we made about other states coming online. So there may be a drop in sales at that point. So I'm almost done. This is the very last portion of the report, which are the local fee recommendations. And we did talk about this earlier, so there may not be a lot more to say. But this, this slide just shows what what the legislature required of us, which was to recommend local fees that are designed to help defray the costs that are incurred by municipalities. As I mentioned earlier, our market structure subcommittee recommended that the only costs would include the processing of the required forms. So that is what we based our recommended fee on. So the recommendation is that the municipalities be able to either set their own local fees, but are capped at $100, or to follow the uniform charges schedule, which is like I think it's 37 cents per hour. I can't remember exactly, but it's the same as what's used for Public Records Act. And again, that local application fee would be in addition to any other permitting fees or zoning fees that a municipality requires. So the justification for that fee is that the board is really going to handle the bulk of the application review. So that burden on local government should be pretty minimal, and processing costs are expected to be pretty low. So that is the justification for setting that fee at $100. And the last slide here was that it was our recommendation in this report that the legislature could direct some of the excise tax revenue to municipalities where the retail sale occurred. And our note here is that that may encourage municipalities to opt in to retail sales. And it also is similar to what some other states are doing with respect to local revenue generation. And with that, I am going to stop talking.
I ask a question, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Mr.
First
Chair.
of all, we're running late, and I would defer to Senator Cummings on how she would like to proceed, given that a break is forthcoming. So,
Senator Brock,
Cummings.
I heard, had a question, and then I think we're going to take a 15-minute break.
Senator
Thank you.
Brock, go ahead.
Thank you. It's just a question regarding revenues. I see that 30% of the excise tax revenues would be used to fund substance misuse prevention programming. There have been some other allegations that full legalization of cannabis will also cause increased costs in a number of other sectors, healthcare being one of them. And the question is there anything in any of the revenue projections to deal with increased costs elsewhere?
Nope, I don't believe there is. I think that our revenue projections are really just based on, our supply and demand model, as I've described, and it really is up to the legislature to decide, what to do with that.
And has the board discussed or looked at the issue of whether or not there are other ancillary costs to be taken into account?
I think that, no, the board hasn't. I mean, the board is certainly considering all of the public health issues that kind of come up when you're talking about adult use cannabis. Our advisory committee's public health subcommittee really dug into a lot of those issues, but they really are not reflected here in this report. But you will see them further, in our January 15th report. I do believe we have some of those recommendations. And also it may be that you would like to look at our proposed rules, which provide like the framework around what the packaging should look like and the required labeling and things like that.
Thank you.
Okay.
There being no further questions, 15-minute break until
It's,
what time
let's
is it?
call it 3:10. So what's 3:25?
Yeah.
That work?